have some food, so please help yourself. We have plenty. We are also doing a local farm frozen meat bundle raffle. We have the meat here in the freezer, so if you want to enter into that, we'll pick a name at the end. So please do that and support a local farm here in Yorkville. We have today with us Jim Patchett and Ron Doetch, and they created their business Solutions in the Land in 2011. And they created their business to provide broad-based solutions for the integration of food and farming systems into the future of our built environment. Their approach involves whole system farm plans, which detail the history, resources, opportunities, and constraints of the land and farm. Their recommendations highlight environmental enhancement, tenancy, revenue streams, and appropriate local, state, and federal resources. So they will share with you more about their approach, and we'll go ahead and get started with Jim. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. So we have an intimate group, so feel free to break in if you have questions, comments, or anything else. I'm probably, obviously, I think I'm doing a little preaching to the choir here this evening, so if I'm sharing things that you're already well aware of, please pardon my redundancies. I will try to move through these sorts of things as quickly as possible. And then Ron is going to, I kind of talk about, how the world works, or it used to work, and how it could work again, and why it's important. And then Ron talks about how we take that understanding into rethinking the whole farming concept from the perspective of economics, social, and certainly the environmental potentials of regenerative or restorative agriculture. Just to give you a little bit of background, I was the founder of a company home-based out of Elmhurst for 25 years called Conservation Design Forum. Jerry Wilhelm, who you might know, was one of my partners for those years, and I'll be sharing certainly input from him in the next few minutes. During that time, what we were involved in, a lot of ecological restoration work, a lot of inventorying of remnant ecosystems, developing long-term restoration management plans, but also involved in a lot of de novo restoration, so building new, reconstructing prairie systems from areas that, a lot of ag areas that have been disturbed. But we were also focused on a lot of urban and suburban green infrastructure systems, which primarily revolved around water, and that's what all of our work revolves around, and rather, whether it was green roofs or porous pavement systems, bioretention, all sorts of things that receive water as a resource and treat it as such rather than generating waste product that gets sent someplace else and becomes very problematic, which I'll talk about. But during that time, we met Ron, when Ron was the executive director of the Michael Fields Institute, which you may be familiar with up in East Troy, Wisconsin. Biodynamic farming, kind of the focus, and he has a long and interesting history, but that's when I met him, and we started working on projects together, some actual historical farm restoration initiatives up in Wisconsin, and eventually, I'm a product of Illinois and Iowa. This is where I grew up, and I'm driving back from Des Moines, Iowa one day, and I'm just in the middle of summer, and it's just looking at, it's in a drought, of course, and I'm looking at just acre upon acre upon acre upon acre of cornfield and soybean, and I called Ron up because we've been thinking about starting maybe a nonprofit that would focus on these issues on regenerative agriculture, and I said, Ron, we got to start a for-profit company, because what farmer is going to want to listen to a couple of, nonprofit goofballs that talk about the things that we do if we can't prove that it's profitable? And it is profitable. That's the best part of it. And so I said, we got to come up with a company name. So I had written a two-part article back in 2009 that was published in a magazine out of Iowa, was called Modern Flood Disasters. They're the reasons for and the cures of, more or less. And the first part dealt primarily with urban scenario, and the second, a month later, dealt with what they called the agricultural dilemma. And the title of the second article was "The Solution is in the Land." And well, Ron was looking at that, and he goes, "Oh, here's our name. The solution is in the land," which it is. But the solution is absolutely in the land. So we formed in 2011. We've been working together under that umbrella ever since. And Ron's really been doing the heavy work from the agricultural perspective, because I was still running the conservation design for him. But we sold that 4 years ago, and now we're focused together. But everything that we do and everything that I ever did was based on gaining a very deep understanding of the historical, physical, and cultural resources and the processes that formed what we think of as nature. And here, of course, we're in northern Illinois, and it's been very easy to become completely disassociated. I'm not saying you folks are. I'm talking about the general public, and I'm talking about farmers in particular, but just as much, in urban areas, to become basically so unaware of how our ecosystems worked historically and what we've done to them. What are the implications of that? What are the cause and effect? And it's reacquainting ourselves with those processes that's so critical. So that's what we've attempted to do, and it's been an interesting lifelong process for me that keeps expanding every single day. So let's see if I can get this to, are you in? There we go. So as E.O. Wilson once said, nature holds the key to our aesthetic, intellectual, cognitive, and even spiritual satisfaction. So there's hope. Well, where do we live? Well, I think everybody knows we live in a part of the world that was glaciated. And we live here in a part of the world that's the youngest landforms and landscapes in North America, because we were part of the Wisconsin glaciation. And when that went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and finally retreated from here, and all that material that was caught up in that ice shield started down our river systems and filled them all in, the big, deep valleys that used to be our Fox rivers, and so on and so forth. And we set up on top of that in that till plain composed of sands and silts and clays that were all ground down from that bedrock underneath us. And so you can kind of see what those images look like as it kind of filled in what used to probably, most of Illinois, I think, probably looked a lot like Galena, driftless areas. That's what it did. I mean, that's the only part of our state that, pretty much the only part that really isn't glaciated, or wasn't glaciated. So where do we live, and what were our ecosystems? Well, around this part of the country, we had two primary types. We had prairies, we had wetlands, but prairies, and our timber areas were, the open-grown, wide-stretching tree savannas. The understory of those savanna systems held most of the apothecary of the native people. Very, very critical to them. We had about 1,000 native plants per county, and of those 1,000 native plants, about half of them would have been historically adapted to a quote-unquote wetland type of habitat. So about 500 of our native wetland plants existed within all of the different kinds of wetlands that we had, from stream corridors to pothole prairies to you name it. Now the thing that's kind of interesting, which again, I know you guys know a lot of this, so I apologize, I'll go through this quick as I can. In a tall grass prairie ecosystem, we're looking at about 12 to 15,000 pounds of root mass per acre. Massive architecture. 90% of the plant mass was below ground, in a root system that could stretch 5, 10, 15 feet or more deep. With that root system, again, 90% or more below ground, now you have a plant system that covers this region geographically that is capable of absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere, but because so much of the plant mass is below ground, you're fixing a good deal of that in the composition of soil organic matter on an annual basis to the tune of about 1 to 2 tons of soil organic matter accumulation. So out of the what's left from the till plain comes the prairie, and the prairie builds the richest soils in the world because of this root system and the process of photosynthesizing and carbon sequestration. Now, we haven't been very good stewards of that resource, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. What's important and why water is so critical to everything that we think about is when it rained on our ecosystems, 3 things occurred, none of which were surface water runoff. Didn't happen. Just didn't happen. We had surface water runoff one time of the year, spring snow melt, and the ground was still frozen, and you had a big melt, and the water had no place to go in the ground, so it run across the surface, and it would accumulate in our low-lying places like our streams and our lakes and our potholes, and it would sit there until it just dried up and then turned up, and then it turned around. So, because most of our rainfall events occurred at less than 1 to 2 inches of rainfall over a 24-hour period, most of that water ended up just getting recirculated right back into the atmosphere through evaporation and transpiration. Very important part of how our whole world here worked. As you got more water, because there's constantly water that's moving down, think about it, you've got a landscape that absorbs water out of the atmosphere every single night. It is a self-irrigating system through condensation, and then it gives it right back the next day, and then it absorbs it at night and gives it back, and so on and so forth. But as the water is accumulating in the ground plane, because it's influenced by topography and gravity, you start to get water moving laterally, but it's always laterally underground. You know, the seeps and the springs, that's how our aquatic systems were formed and sustained. Not by water running across the surface, but by millions of seeps and springs throughout the context, the geographic context of this region, where it would emerge at 54 to 55 degrees, which is the stable mass of the earth. I'll talk about that in a minute. And that's how our aquatic systems were sustained. And of course, the whole of the landscape was so effective at absorbing rainfall and condensation water whenever it came down that it was constantly recharging our aquifers. So, now, one thing that was a real learning thing for me, if I get on here, no, here we go. So, as you look at the way the systems work, as I was talking about, rainfall goes into the ground, ends up materializing itself as a visible wetland or aquatic feature, and it could take days, months, or years for it to get even a few miles. But it was always there. It was always being replenished, and the key is that's how our aquatic systems work. So, this is where I had my moment as a young professional guy. My background was in landscape architecture, water resource engineering, and ecological restoration as a student and as a young professional. And eventually I ended up at the University of Michigan, and then I got a job with a consulting firm, and because I worked for a conservation agency in Iowa for 6 years, we did a lot of our own ecological restoration work. I was assigned to their environmental services group and spent several years doing almost nothing but wetland permitting and wetland mitigation design and implementation. So in Michigan, because they had a state protection act for wetlands that was much more restrictive than the Corps of Engineers, that went into place in 1978, if you went out and built a parking lot that even touched an edge of a wetland, they made you replace that at least at a 1-to-1 basis, and sometimes at a 3-to-1 basis, depending on how high quality they thought that wetland was. And I don't care if it was in an agricultural field that had been tiled and drained, but it had a depression that stayed wet sometimes and historically would have been wet, that was a wetland. You had to go and replace that in some capacity. And so we would try to be really creative in how we did that. I'll give you an example. So we worked a lot with Myers, the big Myers complex, the Myers Thrifty Acres. or as some people called them, shifty takers. But no, that's not what Mark was talking. Sorry, Mark, I was just kidding. So we, obviously they're massive projects, and they would always impact something that had to be mitigated for. So we would design these really kind of, I thought they were pretty cool, organic, things with pre-treatment of the surface water runoff from the storm sewer system and cleansing, and then we would plant all of these native plants, live tubers, rootstocks, seed, everything that you could have, plant plugs, and what you could do within a year was amazing. At least we thought it was amazing. It looked like just this massively big, beautiful thing, flowering and whatever, and wildlife, and we patted ourselves on the back, but we had to come out every year and monitor it, and then report to the Department of Natural Resources. So after the first year, we'd come back the next year, and a lot of stuff that we had planted, it kind of disappeared. Just wasn't there anymore. A year later, almost nothing that we had planted was there. It was things like arrowhead and pickerel weed and some of the sedges and things, they were still there. And as you got up away from the water, if it had a naturalized edge, the prairie plants, they were okay. It was the aquatic things that were just disappearing. But what wasn't disappearing, what was appearing, were what I refer to as the usual suspects. That would be cattails, phragmites, purple loosestrife, and reed carry grass. And within 3 to 4 to 5 years, it was just a massive dominated mess. But it's still a wetland, and they didn't have to redo anything. So I met Jerry Wilhelm at actually I got to come over and spend a couple of days with him because our botanist in the company that I worked with knew him. And he invited us over and we toured around different places in the Chicagoland area. It was really fun. And then he came over to Michigan. I got to go out to dinner with him one night. And then in 1990, we opened a Chicago branch office for Johnson & Johnson and Roy, the firm that I work with. And so I finally got a chance to sit down one-to-one with Jerry over lunch. And I was talking to him about that stuff, why is that all wetlands? We did all this research and painstaking planting, and pretty soon, they don't even look the same. And he just sat there very polite. Didn't know me that well, didn't want to insult me. Had no problems later, but in a professional sort of capacity, of course. And he finally looked at me and he said, well, Jim, you broke the law. Those plants will never grow there. I went, what? I said, Jerry, I didn't break any law. I followed the DNR guidelines, the Fish and Wildlife Service design guidelines for wetland creation, right on down the line. Corps engineered, blah, 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 blah. And he goes, that's not the law I'm talking about. He goes, you broke the botanical law. I went, huh? He goes, well, it reads something like this. You see, plants grow in habitats to which they're adapted. I said, okay. He said, we're here in northeastern Illinois. And he reiterated, or he informed me about the 1,000 plants per native county, 500 of which are, wetland types of plants, and he said, but rather than me explaining it to you, why don't we go out to Bluff Springs Fen? If you've ever been out there, it's the place where if I had my way, there wouldn't be an architect, an engineer, a landscape architect, an ecologist, certainly not a farmer, or anybody else that was involved in anything in the land that didn't go to a place like that where they lived and learn the way the world works, and then apply it to everything that they did. So we went out to Bluff Springs Fen. And you can see here, if you've ever been there, it is the epitome of the way the world works here hydrologically and through ecosystem processes. And so you walk through the trails and you see all these little seeps and springs and water coming out. You could go there right now today and there's water coming out look just like this. Maybe it hasn't greened up quite yet, but and we're as you get through the trail, you see these little streams that have formed, and now they're just gurgling clean water. And he said, Jim, there are organisms that live in this little stretch of stream and in the plants along the edges of these that are a who's who of Illinois threatened and endangered plant species and aquatic organisms, because there are only a few places where this kind of ecosystem is still intact. And and I'm like, what is it? This is really cool, And then we get to the end of the trail, and Jerry goes, you see that right there, Jim? See how that's encroaching out of Poplar Creek up into Bluff Springs Fen? He says, that's right about the line where the 1 year, 24-hour storm flood occurs. That is pretty much where biodiversity disappears. It collapses. He said, because remember we were talking about those 580 plants, he goes, how many of them, after you understand about this, after you understand about how the native systems worked and how they're being affected by this kind of dirty, polluted surface water runoff full of grease and oils and chemicals and shopping carts and other bits and pieces of things. He said, how many of those, in your opinion, have a long-term genetic history of growing in that kind of filth? Of the 500 natives? I went, not many? He goes, none. 0. They can't survive. They have no genetic history of that. We've done that. And when we do that, then they just disappear. And I went, whoa, and I'm like thinking to myself, I don't ever want to work on a project the rest of my life that doesn't try to think about how do I receive water and make it a resource. So that became my mantra and the mantra of my colleagues. But it's not just the ecosystem and water, it's how those ecosystems evolve. Very purposefully around here, as I'm sure you all well know. The human being was an integral part of that process of evolution. As I said, and Jerry always liked to try to remind us, the word for, and I grew up in Muscatine, Iowa, which is essentially the derivation of the Algonquian word for prairie, which is muskota. And fire, annual fire, the harvesting. You got to remember, as Jerry always liked to remind us, 200 years ago, not that long, right here, right where we're standing, still inhabited by native people. White people weren't here yet. I mean, they were in the Chicago small little enclave around Fort Dearborn and the original pieces of that, but this was still native country. It wasn't until the 1830s that they disappeared and were run out. 100 years ago. Now, I should back up. The native people, everything that they needed to survive on a day in and day out basis, their food, their apothecary, their construction projects, their clothing, existed within walking distance of where they lived. It mandated there was no such thing as, hey, I don't know how all that works out there. Their day in and day out existence mandated that they had an intimate understanding of how all these processes work together. Ours don't. Our long-term survival probably does, and we're getting more and more feedback on that. It was almost. So now let's move up to 100 years ago. The typical Midwestern farm produced 26 marketable products. 26. Some more, some a little less, but always had a lot. I grew up as a smaller boy, as a young boy, on our family farm down near Paris, Illinois. And as a little rapscallion running around the farm, we had cattle, and we had hogs, we had sheep, we had chickens. We produced all sorts of different things. And I even had jobs as a kid, not many, but I would feed the chickens and do different sorts of things. And of course we had a horse named Black Beauty, which had to be then, and a collie named Lassie, who kept running away. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, the point is, when my folks moved out, my dad almost died in a farming accident, and continued to farm for 14 years thereafter, and then finally said, I've had enough, and we moved out of this was my great-grandfather's farm. We We moved away from the farm. My uncle and my cousins moved in, and my cousin still lives there today. And then in 1989, we went back for a family reunion. I was so excited to show my wife the farm, you know, see all the livestock. The only thing that was living other than them on this farm was a cat. Everything that had been tailored to go with livestock was just plain gone. I mean, nothing. And I was like in shock almost, but then I shouldn't have been. And of course you get the Illinois River, one of the most truly, just because of the geologic nature of it, and it's the flora and fauna, one of the most biodiverse aquatic systems in the world, until we reverse engineered the canal system, and a few years later, when there wasn't enough volume of flow because of a few years of slow rainfall, we lost virtually everything. Every living organism except for sludge worms ceased to exist in the Illinois River system all the way to Alton because of that. So anyway, again, the native people, food, as I was talking about, you know, so our food, maybe not so much. This is where I grew up, and this is actually was painted from one of my best friend's family's backyard a few years before they had it. This is in 1830s. And that's the Great Muscatine Prairie down there, which is a really quite interesting geological system along the bend of the Mississippi, where the bluffs go way out, and it literally were two branches of the river at one point. And because of the protected nature with the bluffs and the sandy composition of that whole area, it was a habitat that has grown cactuses and amphibians that are only found in deserts of New Mexico and Arizona and the Muscatine Prairie. And there's still a few of those there, actually. So, great biodiversity, and now kind of what have we done to it? And I gotta watch my time here, as Ron will tell me. We haven't been very good stewards of water. We haven't been very good stewards of the land, whether it's contemporary, urban, suburban, or rural agricultural watersheds. And so what we've done is we stripped the capability of the land to absorb water, and we have created dramatically increased runoff and erosion, accumulated discharge, sedimentation, and flooding, which happens pretty much anytime you can get a substantial rain. We're actually trained to do this as engineers. So we collect, convey, and discharge water. We might temporarily keep it back behind in detention or retention systems. We often put fences around them, so we put water in jail because you don't want to get close to that. Or if it's a really nice piece of property, you put an ice fence around it. But nonetheless, we send it out the other end of the pipe, dirty, and in a manner in which the other end of the pipe is never seen before until in a more contemporary venue. And of course, the water qualities, as I said, is often quite an issue. And 40 to 60% of the nitrogen applied to the lawns alone. Forget about the agricultural stuff. Ron will talk about that, where most farming operations that grow corn put down anywhere from 2 to 3 times the amount of nitrogen per year that a crop could pick up. And where does it go? Well, it goes downstream. And we've cut off the human relationship to those landscapes. So they've kind of gotten overgrown and they've eroded away. And you can see here, Jerry, this is a tree that's younger than he is when this picture was taken. And so we have the hydrology of boom and bust, and it rips through our aquatic systems, our streams and our rivers. And the other problem is when it's gone, we don't have any water that's now been absorbed into the landscape to sustain our basal hydrology, so we go through busts. The stream systems can literally dry up. Couldn't have ever happened historically. So the mathematical problem, you can't continue to send 3/4 or more of your annual precipitation away in the form of surface water runoff and expect that there's no problems associated with that. And then, of course, we lose the, our biodiversity, and we live in a place where we invite the usual suspects to come in. So, from a farming perspective, there's a lot of dialogue about whether, human beings influence the climate. And I would say, without wanting to insult anyone, that only a society of people so fundamentally ignorant of the basic processes of the earth and the historic relationships of human beings in those processes could even suggest remotely that humans don't have an influence on climate patterns. It's absurd, but it's not popular by politicians, and it sure as heck ain't popular by farmers. But in the Midwest, in my opinion, they're probably the largest culprit affecting our climate change patterns. Wholesale, just because there's so much of it. If you're ever looking for an interesting article, this is an article that came out in 2022 called The Iowa Singularity, where Chris Jones, who was a professor at the University of Iowa at that time, he's now just recently retired, and he's written another a book that is definitely worth, but it's Chris Jones, if you're interested. And in the Iowa Singularity, I actually have a copy of it right here. You can pull it right off the internet. I mean, he tears into corn in a big way. He's not a popular guy in Iowa. In fact, I think when he wrote the Iowa Swine, what was the Iowa Swine? I can't remember the name of the book. I think they forced him out. So much political pressure to the university that he just said, that's fine, I'll leave. Very good article though, and one of the things that he talks about is, imagine if we took the acreage of Iowa or Illinois, where we have the richest soils in the world, and converted them to actually producing food and fiber. Mm-hmm. No one would go hungry. We could take a portion of that and feed the entire country. And if you've ever seen King Corn, it is definitely worth a look. You can download it. These two guys met each other at graduate school at the University of Massachusetts. Actually, after having been in school for a while and became friends, they found out that both of their paternal grandfathers grew up in the same little itty bitty farm town in northwestern Iowa. And they knew nothing about that. So they decided to go back to the farm town, or go back to the hometown, and grow 1 acre of corn. And then follow that 1 acre of corn through its entire process. Of which then they said, you are what you eat. You are definitely what you eat. And they started doing all these, tests, chemical tests, DNA tests, and we were just walking, talking corn stalks. But there are other issues related to our situation here, and I didn't drive through something quite as bad as this last year, but I was coming home from Iowa on I-88, and all of a sudden this big dust thing came across the interstate, and I'm thinking, do we not learn? I mean, this 6 people did. In fact, I think later there were more that actually died from this. That isn't just poor land management, it's criminal. And of course, what goes on there, well, it takes, when you have no means to hold the soil together anymore, it's compacted and it's erodible, then it goes, and it just keeps going. And it carries everything with it, and it gets out into our streams and then our rivers, and eventually on down to the Gulf of Mexico, excuse me, where now the dead zone is as large as the state of New Jersey, stretching all the way from eastern Texas into Alabama, because primarily from nutrient loading. Yeah, yep, I'm working through there quickly. So, and of course, algal blooms in the Lake Erie, and is our time to 6:30? Is that with Q&A?
6:15 with about 15 minutes of questions.
Okay, I'm going to end up right now, just real quick. Couple other quick and important things. About 4 feet down here is the stable mass of the earth, and that's geothermal heating and cooling. It's also what was working with these ecosystems to transport water and temperature through this system. So when you look at how that living land works, we've got C. Hopkins Cafe, mighty good if you're familiar with that. So you got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, iodine, nitrogen, sulfur, calcium, ferrous, magnesium, and whether they are present in the soil, whether they come in from the atmosphere, or whether they go both ways. This is how the land worked historically. You had billions of organisms per cubic foot of soil. It was a living landscape, a living, the body earth, if you will. And the microorganisms and the macronutrients and micronutrients. So you think about that, well, how does that compare to us? Well, we come from that. So look at us. Ooh, we got the same exact macronutrients and micronutrients. That's how our bodies work. And if we don't have them, we get sick and die. And of course, we need pollinators, since up to 80% of crop production worldwide relies on pollinators, because there aren't too many floating around right now. And of course, what have we done to that? Well, repeated tillage basically takes everything out of the soil. You oxidize all of the fixed carbon, the soil organic carbon disappears. That's the water holding and the living component of that. And then you get runoff and you get compaction. And then you put in tile and you take the water away even faster. And what we're left with is, what would have been a healthy rhizosphere, now when it's gone, you've lost the contiguous connection to the stable mass of the earth. Soil moisture decreases. Many of the organisms that relied on a stable habitat, the microorganisms in the soil, they're gone. You throw them on the chemicals, it really kills them, or it sends the whole system completely out of whack, and Ron can talk about that a bit more. And then evaporation, transpiration is completely screwed up, and so now you have a situation where hydrology, weather patterns, biodiversity, and global warming comes out as a result of all of these interrelated things. And I think that's a good place to stop and get my friend Ron up here, because otherwise I just keep blabbering on. I find it interesting, but I appreciate that here's where it starts to get really interesting, is what Ron can do. Let's see if we can get yours.
Now you know why I can't take Jim to Iowa.
Okay. Right there.
Perfect.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Yep. So, Jim gets to do all the dark spots, I get to do all the bright spots, right? So, mentioned that we formed a company called Solutions in the Land. How does this move forward?
You could try the arrows.
I can do it this way. Why don't you show me? There.
All right. So it might have just taken a minute to kind of register, but you should be able to use those.
Okay.
Yep.
So as Jim mentioned, we started about 14 years ago with Solutions in the Land, and our idea was to work with operators and figure out how to increase farm gate income and reduce risk simultaneously, and do all positive things for the farm. Well, it turned out that through word of mouth, we were working more with landowners than operators, and then it turned out that the landowners were getting a hold of us because their operator didn't understand what they wanted to do with their farm. So I like to say that back in those days, the landowner thought the land operator had a grand plan for the whole farm. The operator thought the landowner had a plan for the farm, and it turned out that neither one did. So what landowners complained about was, if they were an absentee landowner and their tenant was doing something on the land, one of the unintended consequences of the local food movement was landowners started to ask the question, what does my tenant do with his farm? And so he calls up the tenant and say, you're not growing GMO corn, are you? And the farmer said, yeah, but I'm gonna give you $250 an acre every year. I'm gonna be growing GMO corn. And then the two were at the odds with each other. And so we had to change that conversation. And it turned out in almost every case where we've done a whole system farm plan in the last 14 years, the tenant was happier with our plan than the landowner initially. And it was because we had to realign some of the landowner's expectations of the tenant and get the landowner to understand the world that the tenant lived in. I like to talk about, you know, some of the things that are right with our agriculture. I bring Jim along and talk about everything that's wrong, and then I can talk about what's right. Chickens, there what's right. In 2022, that's the most recent ag census that we've had, and to bring it kind of home, Kendall County agriculture contributed $154 million to the economy. Kane County contributed $284. Interestingly, Kendall County's 99% row crops, 1% livestock. Kane County's 20% livestock and 80% row crop. I don't think you can interpolate from that livestock farming is more profitable than agriculture. But it does overlap a little bit. It is more than one activity that way on the same acre. Jim talked about erosion and nutrient runoff. We have soil that leaves the farm with the water. We have soil that leaves the farm with the wind. And we have a lot of tile in this ground. And with that tile water leaves our nitrogen and our phosphorus. So the phosphorus and nitrogen loading of our streams is not coming from a factory, and it's not necessarily coming from surface runoff, although our surface water runoff has increased tremendously. A lot of that nitrogen and phosphorus is coming through the tile water because both nitrogen and phosphorus will combine with water very readily, nitrogen more so, but they then leave the field with the water. So another issue that's going on right now is, and it has been for the last 20, 25 years, is farmland conversion. We just finished the McHenry County Comprehensive County Plan 2050 last year, and we popped some things out. I put McHenry County's number up here, but farmland, Kendall, Kane, McHenry, has been decreasing by about 2 to 3% a year. And so we had a partner on the project, and they said, yeah, but in 2008 and 2009, building houses stopped. You know, so surely we're not losing any more farmland. Our disappearance of farmland has been equal since the housing bust as it was during the housing bust. But if you think about it, we built out a lot more infrastructure, we built more warehouses, we're building more renewable energy, and I'm going to talk a little bit more later about water recharge zones. We're not building those yet, but I would anticipate in the future, as much as we're focused today on building renewable energy, we'll be focused on water recharge zones. So, peeking around the curve, that's something to come. Another thing that's we're aware of today are the challenges with the climate. So I don't see climate change as a political issue, it's an agronomy issue for me. I look at 5 years of charts on most farms that we look at. We look at farms all across the US. I can tell you that in 2018, DeKalb County, your buddies over there, Dave, they had record rainfall in 2018, pretty sure it was 18. They had record rainfall and they had a drought. Their crops dried up, they lost 20 bushel of corn to the acre, and they had 50 inches of rainfall. How can that happen? We have enormous rainfall events, but we have a longer period of time between them. I call them mini droughts. Someone has recently given them another name. I'm looking for a better name. But what do you call a drought in the middle of the growing season when you're having record rainfall. And so when I go to Iowa, depending on which county I'm looking at, that may have happened in 2016 or 18 or 21. It wasn't necessarily the same year as DeKalb County. It's extremely regional, the way these droughts and floods occur anymore. So when you're farming, you have to have a strategy for the risk of drought and flood in the same year. So we're growing teff grass in what we call our enterprise plots. We're trying to do sub-acre plots of alternative crops. Jim mentioned at the turn of the century, farmers were doing an average of 26 crops or had 26 income streams. When we do a whole system farm plan, we want that farm to have 20 uniquely different revenue streams. 20 that are not corn and soybeans, or 18 that are not corn and soybeans, because we have to look at different time frames. If you grow a crop of hybrid poplars, you can harvest them in 10 years. You can get 300 board feet of lumber from each tree, and you can get a whole lot of trees on an acre. You can make way more than you can grow than growing corn, but you only get paid once every 10 years. And then you have stumpage after that you can sell for renewable energy. But the other problem is, we did a farm on the East Coast in the Hudson Valley. I had a lumber buyer there that said they would contract the trees and for $300 a tree the day the farmer planted, as long as he would keep them well for 10 years when he came to harvest. And he said, if I give the farmer $300 a tree then, I will make a lot more money in 10 years when I harvest those trees than what the farmer made. So there are crops like that, but there's certainly impairments that come with those crops. In the Midwest, poplar lumber is not desirable. People don't use it for framing houses. They don't use it for much of anything in the Midwest. Poplar trees are popular. And so there's not good demonstrations. So in 2016, Jim and I worked together with a farmland owner up in Kenosha, and we did 2 farm plans for him. He had 2 farms, we did 2 farm plans, and after a couple of years, and we delivered the farm plan, and we went over it, he's like, hey, I want you to come and live on my farm and implement this farm plan. I said, what, are you crazy? Nobody can do that. No. My wife and I moved up there, and we've been doing demonstrations, and you all are invited to come to Kenosha in July, and we have an open house. We grow 100 different crops in the gardens. We grow 20 in our enterprise zone. This year we'll have sun hemp as a seed crop again this year, and sun hemp will mine about 100 pounds of potash from deep in the soil and bring it to the surface. Buckwheat does a good job with phosphorus. One of the things that I like to see is mining our own farm for our own nutrients. Farmers spend $36.5 billion a year on inputs and fertilizer and chemicals. I think we ought to be trying to grow some of those. So climate change brings some challenges. It brings some opportunities. When I talk about looking differently at nutrients, you know, we've not been using synthetic fertilizers that long. We've really ratcheted up the use since about 1950, really. So what, 70 years, we don't have a lot of history using the fertilizer, but the evidence is out there today that argues that we probably haven't increased our productivity with the volume of fertilizer that we're using. We're finding regenerative practices. Dave asked me earlier, what's with the term regenerative agriculture? And I answered him by saying, well, we got tired of talking about organic, and everybody's talking about sustainability of everything now. And so we just grabbed a new term and we're calling it regenerative or restorative. But I do think, I work with a lot of universities. University of Illinois, where I graduated from, has been terrible about doing the research that we want done as farmers. And I'm here to tell you that they are doing leading edge research on biologicals. They're doing leading edge research on the values of soil health. They're doing some really good stuff, and they've been under a lot of pressure to do different research. And University of Minnesota, Iowa State, University of Wisconsin are all looking at agriculture as a system and what the impact is of the system on the land. So I have great hopes that we're gonna see some things out of there. Let's see, where am I at here? So at the bottom of this slide, what are we gonna get from the farm? What do we get from our agriculture? And I think we do think too narrowly. We get food, fiber, feed, fuel, fun, and probably most important is we get a flow of ecological services. We get the sunlight, we get rain, we get wind. Those things may seem really obvious to everyone, but when we're sitting down to do a farm plan, we're gonna focus on economics, we're gonna focus on social acceptance, we're gonna focus on environmental issues. This flow of environmental services, if we could actually measure it, put a value on it, it's estimated that it's greater than the world's gross domestic product. That's how valuable these ecological services are. So when we talk about ecological services, that doesn't mean that we're going to abandon farming techniques that we've learned. It doesn't mean we're gonna abandon technology that's been labor saving. It means that we're gonna start to look at ways that we can leverage these natural services or ecological services. How can we keep more water on the farm? Every farm I deal with, you know, they have too much water in the spring, they don't have enough water in July and August, and then once Mother Nature gives you that late summertime drought, then she makes you mud the crop out in the fall. So how do you manage that? And part of the way you manage that is you diversify or extend your crop rotations. What are those other crops? We know that oats and wheat and barley and some of those small crops small grain crops are not only hard to get onto the market, hard to get paid for oftentimes, they're pretty darn fragile. So corn breeders have been breeding corn for what they call stiff stalk, because it stands up in a derecho most of the time. It takes a lot of wind, it takes a lot of abuse. And in the small grain crops, we don't have that resilience. We've done a lot to promote small grains, baking quality wheats, more human food crops. But the fact is, we're dealing with a more adverse climate, and it's hard to deal with a more fragile crop. So we like to say that we don't think you have to farm to the middle of the road to make money. You should be able to rotate fields, extend the crop rotation, and you're not gonna eat out of just one bag of beans, not the same, just corn and soybeans as being your only income proposition. So being able to mine your farm for some fertilizers, some different things, you can certainly cut those production expenses. We can't do much about the market. I'm working on a scaling up project of local produce in southeast Iowa right now, and you know, I tell the farmers, you know, if they're going to produce something different, the market's got to give them the money. There's no place else for that money to come from, and it doesn't matter, you know, what conservation programs you can participate with, like the filter strip program I really like, because you can put up to 150 feet next to adjacent to a perennial stream, and it'll filter soil, it'll filter surface runoff, and you get paid handsomely for those acres. And I like that program, but you have to have other crops that you can take to the market. You can't put the whole farm in conservation and be providing for societal needs. So I like to say, what is soil? Soil is that thin layer, as Jerry Wilhelm always says, is that thin layer that separates heaven and earth that provides all life. It's very fragile. Our topsoils are fragile. They're about 45% mineral and ash, about 5% organic matter, hopefully, 25% water, and 25% air. And so, particularly in this northeast portion of Illinois, we've compacted these soils, and for water to go into the soil, air has to come out of the soil. So we have to have those air pockets. We have to have that porosity. So we need to farm our soils in a way, and I suggest that where did that one go? Look at our farms more three-dimensionally. We're not just farming on a horizontal plane. We're farming all the way to the center of the earth. When we bought that farm, we got all the rights that went with it. We got the mineral rights until we sold them off, or the previous owner did. We get the water rights. So around the world, water is the issue. Both the volume of water and the quantity of water. We could put a value on that. When we look at inputs like nitrogen, back in 21, 22, into 23, nitrogen was costing farmers about $1 a pound. Well, in organic production, we don't have sources of synthetic nitrogen, so we have to generate the nitrogen on our farms. So in terms of nitrogen alone is about a $16.8 billion industry in agriculture. Our air's 76% to 78% nitrogen. It's N2, it's an inert gas. The molecules are hooked to each other. But you ever get a lightning storm and the next day your grass is greener? You come out after a lightning storm and say, I think that grass grew an inch or two. It's because nitrogen comes down with thunderstorms because it breaks that N2 bond. The nitrogen combines with the water molecule, steals the hydrogen molecule off the water, frees the oxygen, or you get ozone, and it comes down as NH3 or NH4, which is plant available ammonia nitrate. So we know we can get nitrogen from our air. We've done it with rhizobia bacteria for probably 100 years. Rhizobia bacteria will grow on the roots of a legume crop, and it'll pull nitrogen out of the air, leave for the plant in the soil. And we have microbes today that can do that. Healthy soils will do that. Compost will do that. There are a lot of ways to do that. Other ways to get nitrogen fertilizer is from fish. We've had several fish farms as clients. We did one in Jackson, Michigan. They had 3 million gallons of fresh water a day from an artesian well. They had no electricity to pump 3 million gallons of water a day. And the only way they could make money on the fish farm was to sell the nitrogen, because the fish put off so much nitrogen, and nitrogen has so much value in agriculture that the majority of their profit came from selling the nitrogen. So what I like to say are fish are nitrogen generators that you get to eat. Food waste, and I've been working with food waste at different scales. We had a project over in Muscatine, Iowa, where we were looking at all their collection of waste, and it was a project on how to turn all the waste to energy. They were bringing, in Muscatine, Iowa, bringing food from Illinois because the Illinois Department of Commerce was paying $40 a yard to divert food waste in Illinois from landfills. So Muscatine, Iowa was soliciting waste haulers from Illinois to bring their food waste to Muscatine. What they discovered was that they get a lot of nitrogen out of the food waste. Food waste is a real rich stream. What we have in this part of the world, we have a lot of restrictions on what we can do with food waste. We even have a lot of restrictions on what we can do with compost. Every county has their own compost laws. McHenry County, when we did the project there, we wanted to take the horse manure and make compost and have the horse farm sell compost as agriculture fertilizer from the horse stall. Couldn't legally do it. And it's partly because of Waste Management's monopoly on waste hauling in Northeast Illinois. It's partly local politics. We need some policy changes to be able to do some things differently. Food waste by the Illinois EPA is considered toxic waste. So something that we almost put in our body because we didn't when we threw it out the back door is now toxic waste. So there's 2,000 pounds of food that come through the door for every man, woman, and child. 800 pounds of it goes out the back door, and we take it out the back door and we put it in a dumpster where nobody can see it in the back alley, and the truck comes at 4 o'clock in the morning and clatters and bangs the lid and wakes us up hauling it out of there. Our food comes from the land. It should go back to the land. We haven't gotten smart enough yet to figure out how to do that. I would argue that our plate waste is going down as food prices go up, and we don't need to worry about plate waste. We need to worry about pre-consumer waste. In Kane County, you have the Northern Illinois Food Bank. I think they're in 13 counties. They throw out a tremendous amount of food every week that is pre-consumer food waste. That food waste could go to a farm, be incorporated in with livestock manure, and could go right out on the fields after a season of composting and be very rich in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. There's a farm in McHenry County that's doing that, and they have tremendous compost, but they are licensed as a composting yard. They've gone through all the legal hoops that they've had to go through. They're the first one I know of in Northern Illinois that have been able to do it. I think it's very, very viable. Our food waste is 30% of our food system pre-consumer. So we can manage pre-consumer food waste. It's in big pallets. It's easy to depackage. And I think we will be doing, incorporating that food waste on farms with other farm manures, and it could cut our fertilizer bill tremendously, if not at some point replace it entirely. And I'm just sharing, kind of a glimpse of the world that we've been living in for the last 14 years. We get to a lot of places, we talk to a lot of landowners, a lot of businesses, a lot of farmers. Some things are working. I like to say that what's important to us are the things that aren't working, because we don't need to repeat those mistakes. And we learn from our mistakes, and we're just kind of a cross-pollinator where we can get out and see a whole lot of mistakes that have been made and see a way of doing things that's working from time to time. I used to do a talk called Water's a Crop, but DuPont and Miller Coors, which is owned by a South African company, started a project called Water's a Crop. They trademarked the name, and they told me I couldn't do Water's a Crop anymore. But there are times in the spring where if water was a valuable crop, we as farmers could say, I got so much water, I got stuff out, just lay it out in the field out there. Just water laying there. Be like a Texas oil man saying you got a pasture full of oil. I got a pasture full of water. I think we'll get there. We're going to find a way to put a value on water that can get back to the farm gate. Don't know exactly how or when. It's coming to a farm near you. Agritourism, conservation easements. What we have here in Northeast Illinois is a whole lot more people than we used to have. And these people have money for houses, they have money for lots of things, and they live in a world of cheap food. We have a cheap food policy in this country. When you go to the supermarket, you're gonna find two things. You're gonna find that food doesn't really cost very much for what you're getting. You can buy a whole chicken for $3, $4. If you take it home and you throw it in a big pan and you cook it down for an hour or so, you got $8 worth of chicken broth. Because if you go over and buy that packet of chicken broth, that's about what it's gonna cost you. But if you buy the chicken pieces parts at McDonald's and buy your chicken broth separate, it's probably costing you a lot of money. But we have a cheap food policy, and we have 4,000 calories available to every man, woman, and child in the US every day. Now, personally, at my age, if I eat more than about 1,500 calories, I'm in trouble. But we have abundant food, and we have cheap food. And that's not addressing the quality of the food. You know, grandmother said we should eat more fruits and vegetables. Mother said we should eat more fruits and vegetables. And it should come as no surprise today that the medical industry's unearthing brand new research that says we should be eating more fruits and vegetables. I mean, who didn't know that already? But as we have more urbanites around us, you know, William Cronin, who was an economist at the University of Wisconsin, wrote a book called Nature's Metropolis, the Building of Chicago. And in that he said that urban and rural can only exist in each other's presence. And I believe that's true. The scenery's different in the urban than it is in the rural, but we're interdependent and we depend on each other. We don't have a farming system and a food system. We have a food and farming system. We have one system. It's a very complicated system, but how do we get more support for the farm practices that we're doing, that we're employing, that we can tell people about? How do we get more social support? The greater majority of Americans live in urban areas and live on farms. It's decreased rapidly. That's a news alert for the Back to the Landers. You know, back in the 60s, we had all the Back to the Lander movements. Like, you're losing the war, people are still moving in town. Okay, so urbanites don't want to all become farmers. They don't want to go all have goats and strawberries. They want to have a connection to their food. They want to have a connection maybe to a farm. They maybe want to take their kids to a farm. A farm isn't a children's playground, but how do we set the structures up that we're not overrun looking like a carnival, but we're farming the same way that we wanted to farm, and there's some social benefit to that that brings money to the farm. And so one of the things that we're doing in Kenosha, we're on Highway 31 where there's 20,000 cars go by a day. We're across from UW Parkside, Petrified Springs, Hawthorne Hollows and Nature Preserve across the street the other way. What we're trying to do is figure out how do you balance out staying true to your farm, the way you want to farm it, the way you should farm it, and what social values you can offer people to intersect with your farm in some way. We don't have kids playing in the gardens. We don't have kids' tools or toys for when we have an open house and people do bring their kids, but we need to figure that out. I talked to one of the agritourism spots in McHenry County on Highway 173, and she said, I hate this business. All I do all day, every weekend, is stand at the road and tell people, no, you can't bring your dogs in. This is not a dog park. You can't bring your dogs. How do we figure that out? You know, we're smart people. We can do it. We need to monetize the experience of the farm without sacrificing how we farm. And we need to tell the message of why we farm the way we do, and we use the practices that we use. So, when I talk about future needs, and when we do a farm plan, what I have rattling around in my brain and looking at opportunity is, you know, how do we have farmland preservation zones where all the neighbors agree that we want to keep this agriculture? I was in Germany and Switzerland in 2002, and we toured all these farms. We were on different farms every day. We were at a farm in southern Germany where the farmer knew we were coming. We were a group from Wisconsin on a trade mission, and he had the newspaper out there, and they were doing a story on us. And when we got off the bus, he handed us a shot of his own home brew that he was celebrating, and we had to stay for dinner. And he had a new barn, but the barn looked like an old barn, and his house was in the end of it, and the cows were in it, and the hay was in it, and he was preserving old livestock breeds. And I said, how can you afford to grow those old brown Swiss cows? We never could get any milk out of them. And he's like, the government pays me to preserve these old breeds. But he wasn't compromising any on his farm. He was farming very traditionally, but farming traditionally is for the tourist in Europe. And so much money comes to Europe from tourism, they don't want to make the farm into a carnival. They don't want to make it a dog park or a kid's park. They want it to be a farm. And I think that we can do that here. I put Recharge Jones in the same place. Our aquifer is running out of water. We are on a sand aquifer. Most of our wells are shallow wells. They're going dry. We're not recharging the water that falls from the sky. Agriculture has tiled it out. We've got all these fields tiles. We've designed all these things that Jim talked about to get rid of water faster. And we need to keep water longer. And we need to get our soils to well infiltrate in the ground. I think that the NRCS office could, in the near future, offer a program that says, we're going to run Russell on your farm, the revised universal soil loss equation. We're going to tell you how much of the rainfall you're re-infiltrating by the way you farm and the rainfall that fell and how it fell. And you're going to be issued a water credit that's redeemable for something for infiltrating water. We've got to focus on re-infiltrating water. We need to develop more income streams. I talked about earlier without sacrificing the way we protect our farm, the things we do on our land. I've had so many farmers say, you know, we're getting a bad rap nationally that we're doing a poor job farming, we're doing a poor job taking care of the land. We as farmers aren't very good at telling our story. We don't tell people what all we are doing to preserve water quality and wildlife quality. We do a lot of things we don't talk about. We could have better local policy to support agritourism. Right now, in most locations, if you start anything agritourism, you gotta have enough parking on your farm. The only way the county's gonna let you park cars is if you go broke and you're having an auction, you can park all the damn cars alongside the road you want. But if you're trying to make money, don't park alongside the road. We need to change some of that. Conversion of non-farm uses. One of the things that we've got going in Kenosha County, we got warehouses going up all over with 1 million square foot footprint, and we can't stop that. That's Interstate 94. Kenosha is the warehouse district. That's okay. What we can't do is let renewable energy come in and take over 5,000 acres of continuous land, run cables across 79 wetlands, not put any money in an escrow account to decommission the solar field, when most people know that there are 2 countries right now that are putting up solar panels in space to microwave electricity back to Earth. So when the Paris Solar Project went in Kenosha County, which is 5,900 acres of contiguous farmland, they said, we're not going to put up escrow for decommissioning for 14 years. So that tells me they're going to file bankruptcy in 13 years. And they're not going to pay those farmers to take those pedestals down. Those pedestals are going to cost a lot to take out. Yes, it can be returned to farmland. Somebody needs to pay for that. The energy company needs to put the money up. When we did this comprehensive county plan for McHenry County, I got so much pushback because I talked negative about solar. Solar doesn't have to be negative. In Kenosha County, they could have put solar panels on the top of every one of those warehouses. But that's okay. There's appropriate land to put them on. It isn't contiguous. Our farmland doesn't lie that way. Don't be hoodwinked by renewable energy that we're all green and we're all good, because there's some bad things that you need to be to be aware of. There needs to be more coordination between farmers, residents, businesses, and planners. There's a company now called Zero Footprint. They're selling credits for your farm to businesses that want to advertise that they're supporting water infiltration, wildlife, conservation of soil, reduced fertilizer, extended crop rotations, blah, blah, blah. Where are they selling them? To restaurants. Restaurants who can merchandise these values to their clientele and give the farmer the money for merchandising those credits. So I think it's Zero Footprint. They have a website, farms can sign up. I would be very leery. I think it's the beginning. Most of those things kind of tend to be scammy when they first come out. And if they're successful, they get the bugs knocked out of them. And with caution. But I think that's the direction we're going to go. I think, we as a people are strong enough and intelligent enough to realize what agriculture does for us as a society. And I think, we'll pitch in as a society in a equalized, fair way of supporting things better. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you.
Yes.
We have a few minutes for questions. I just want to interject, if you haven't entered into the meat raffle, we'll pick that name right after we're done with questions.
So I'm wondering if you've worked with any farmers who have removed some of, or broken, however they do it, some of the drainage tiles, and what does that look like if a farmer does do that? What?
So we're
what's the
doing
effect
that.
on the water and.
Yeah, we're doing that on both our farms. One farm's at 80, one's at 160. We've gone around over the last 5 years, we've talked to all the neighbors, and all of the neighbors thought that we were going to jam up their drainage. And you know what we discovered again, that we always knew, or we knew a long time ago, is everybody that shares a watershed in farm communities should talk to each other.
Mhm.
That would be a really good idea. And so, on the one farm where we're breaking the tiles, we still have a main channel in our creek. It's still, all of the neighbors' tiles are 4 feet above the stream. It's not going to affect their drainage at all. But they don't care about our drainage, they care about their drainage. Others have done it. I know pattern tiles going in every day all over the country. I don't know why, but.
But what about the town management program that was instituted? That certainly makes sense.
Yeah, there's a DWM, Drainage Water Management Program, and most people have never heard of it, but the NRCS will pay to have a valve installed on your drain tile. So when you get done planting corn, you can go turn the valve off, back the water up. When you get ready before harvest, open the tile, drain your fields, and then turn it back off again. But I know farmers who have put in pattern tiles and are talking about putting in center pivots because they're drying out in July and August. It's like, turn the valve off the tile and back the water. And let's improve the water holding capacity of the soil.
I'm excited about, for my piece of this, which is more on the native landscape restoration component of these buffer strips and so on and so forth. I mean, it used to be, you had a CRP program, and you'd set it aside for 10 years, you couldn't do anything with it, you couldn't make any money off of it other than what the NRCS was gonna pay you. And at the end of the 10 years, you either re-enroll and it just becomes a more of a drain financially, or you plow it all back up again. And Purdue University, their Sustainable Ag Institute, did a research study on, this is back in the 90s, on 10-year cycles in native landscape, native grasses. So you're sucking down and fixing all that carbon. What they found out is within 15 days of plowing it back up after 10 years, 90% of all of the fixed carbon had gone back into the atmosphere, and within 30 days it was in net loss again. I was doing a talk in Iowa City at the University of Iowa a few years ago, and one of the DNR guys came over to me afterwards and said, "Do you realize here in Iowa we expect that we'll have, I think it was, I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands of acres of CRP that was scheduled to come out of rotation that year that would be all plowed back up. When you think that it's 16 pounds of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide per gallon of gasoline that gets burned out, imagine the, let's say, 20,000 pounds per acre that had been fixed over 10 years, all back in the atmosphere from hundreds of thousands of acres within a 30-day period. You talk about some air pollution, but you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't touch it, you don't know what's going on. And so,
There's a couple farms in Michigan now that the farmers have said, I figure when it rains and water runs off my farm, it's costing me money. So they've designed systems to keep all rainwater on their farm when it rains.
but the nice thing with this 150-foot wide buffer, I mean, Iowa State did research back in the 90s with 30-foot wide buffers along stream systems. If it had native landscape systems, not grown grass or anything else, but with native systems, it arrested the erosion, it took the nutrients out of the water and the subsurface flow, and basically reduced runoff and improved water quality. Imagine what you could do with 150 feet on either side of the stream. And you know, I did a program a couple of years ago, and a woman came up to me afterwards and said, my best friend bought a farm, they live outside of Bloomington, Normal, and that's where my mom's family was from, on a farm over by Colfax, Illinois. Anyway, she said, I was so excited, we have this house, and I planted all of these butterfly gardens, and nothing ever came. Well, of course nothing's ever gonna come. It's a freaking desert of death around you for miles in every which direction. There's no habitat, you know, for anything. I look at these 300-foot wide buffers full of native landscapes, full of flowers, and it's like a super pollinator highway, all interconnected, going right up all of our stream systems and then up like fingers into, and you farm around that, and all of a sudden now you got something going on, you know?
Question.
Yes.
How bad are these chemtrails affecting the farmland?
That's a complicated question. I was at Southern Illinois University one day, and this one woman was taking water samples and sending them in to be analyzed. And I said, you know, how often you send them in? And it's like every 3 days. I said, what if it doesn't rain? She said, well, I send in a dry water sample. It's like, well, what's a dry water sample? And she said, it's just a sample of air that's fallen into it over the same 3-day period. You know, it's different when we have rainwater in it, but they call it a rain sample, but it's whatever else went in the cotton. And she told me all the different things they're finding in those cups that are falling out of the air. So some farmers are complaining that now that they've put scrubbers on the power plants, sulfur's not coming out of the air, and our ground is getting too alkaline because we don't have enough sulfur falling on the ground. In New York, they're complaining that the anhydrous of the Midwest comes down over there and kills the leaves on their trees. But, you know, we share this air, and I know in Kenosha the last couple summers we've had tons of smoke from Canada, and I couldn't believe it came so far. I don't think we have a good handle on what's coming out of the air and where it's coming from and what effect it's having on our land. I don't think there's nearly enough research on it. I don't think there's any easy answers. I don't think there's a silver bullet. I don't think there's like a one thing that's towering above everything else.
You know, there's a...
Last summer, we planted our tomato plants and they were beautiful. And then, I would say, I don't know how long they were beautiful, but I went to the backyard and they were all wilted. I mean, everywhere.
Was the leaves curling?
Even
Did the leaves curl up?
everywhere, but not only in my backyard, in her house, in Lake Somerset. I mean, far, far away. The same time.
Dicamba will move 5 to 8 miles You know, we've renamed 2,4-D about a half dozen times. We called it Banville, we've called it a few other things. Now we call it dicamba. It still volatilizes like 2,4-D did back in the 50s when we first invented 2,4-D. But
But it never
grapes,
happened
trees,
before.
gardens,
Never, ever. I had
It's
my.
overnight.
It was overnight that it happened, but I've been planting tomato plants for at least 10 years and it never happened. It was the weirdest thing. I'm like, what did they spray?
dicamba's been the by far the biggest culprit. And it's outlawed in some states.
Yeah.
There are so many lawsuits in so many states, and I know a lot of input suppliers that will not put it down.
Have they upped the date on that as far as when you can spray? I think they've upped the date. You can't spray it as long as you used to.
Right.
I don't know what the date is.
And I'll guarantee you, one input supplier that is pretty well known won't spray it. They killed 2 acres of our blueberries, our raspberries, some old trees. They just decimated our
Yeah.
place,
The
which I
trees
can't.
are dying too,
and-
right?
My wife called me and said, there's a sprayer, I can smell it. I went down, I got in the truck, asked him what he was spraying. It was like, 1034, maybe something else and something else.
They don't know.
And what else?
They won't tell you.
And he
right?
said dicamba.
Yeah.
The wind was blowing at 28 miles an hour.
What's that down?
I think we're ready for the raffle. I will leave you with one thought. If you're looking for a very interesting read, this is an article that Jerry found a couple years ago called On Climate Change in Illinois, Its Cause. And as you read this article, it traces exactly what we've been talking about, how you eliminate the actual living soil, you compress, you tile, you drain, it gets hot, and what this gentleman referred to, his name is Amos Sawyer, refers to as the aqueous agent. When it's no longer your friend, it's always working against you. And 24/7, and it never, because that down cutting, pretty soon the groundwater table's way lower than it used to be. Everything up here is hot. And then he starts talking about how you have, where we used to get those gentle rainstorms frequently because there's always moisture in the atmosphere and very stable, and now it's hot and it's stochastic, and it's, we get these massive things, and then we go for long periods of time, we don't get any rainfall, so we have these droughts. He presented this paper in St. Louis at a symposium in 1874. Dead on.
Right.
Dead on. I'm sure they thought he was a fruitcake.
200 years, right?
Could I-
150.
150.
Yeah, some time ago, I read an article that claimed that the United States and China were spraying the upper atmosphere with a fine solution of aluminum and some other things that was ordered to reflect some of the sun so to prevent climate change. And they claim that over a period of time, the particles from this solution do filter back to Earth into the ocean, and that the water going towards the shore and that kind of congregates it along the shorelines, and that was what was responsible for the dead zone around the shorelines, and that our biological production of oxygen from algae and stuff would be affected as it went farther out into the ocean, and that we were eventually going to have a deficiency of oxygen in the air because the plants that produce it were going to die. And so I have a cousin that's in the Coast Guard that goes around the coast of all the United States, and he said that there's a dead zone near the shore. This is true that a lot of the plankton at the bottom of the sea close to the shore is dying off. And so I wondered if this stuff, if it does slope back and affects the ocean, it must have an effect on the land too. And I wondered if you knew anything about that.
I am not familiar with that. Ron, is that, yeah. There's lots of things that we probably don't quite understand, but I'm not familiar with that
Well,
one.
after I read the article, I kept watching the sky, and I could see some planes, 4 or 5 at a time, way, way up there, leaving a vapor trail, and just going back and forth, and I don't know if that's what they were doing, but it sure looked like it to me. Hmm?
That's the chemtrails.
I fly international. It's all over. It's all over the world.
Spray the chemicals.
I mean, no, I mean, they're doing it everywhere.
I've heard of it.
Paris, France, Greece,
We'll see,
England.
the climate affects everything that you've talked about tonight. And so to me, that would be a big issue, that we, some way to check up on it.
Can I have just a quick question? GMO seeds and farming, you know, the GMO seeds, Europe doesn't even allow it, and that could be ruining our soil. That's what they're claiming, that it's very harmful to your soil.
Well,
So,
Ron has a lot more expertise in this than me, but GMO crops plus Roundup Ready, which
and
means,
Roundup, yeah.
that they just pour Roundup on and on and on and on. And that's one of the things Gary Wilhelm said, in my younger days of botany, we'd be out botanizing some areas, and you go along ag fields and there'd be weeds and stuff, and at least there was some habitat for pollinators. He says, since GMO and Roundup Ready came out, there's nothing.
And that's ruining our soil, and Europe won't even buy our crops.
Ron used to work for a Japanese company in Toshu, and he was like North American grain manager. If you brought a GMO product into Japan, they'd arrest you, right?
Yeah, so could that be affecting our soil? Like this whole ecosystem, it's all with the Roundup and.
But I'll
And
follow that
humans,
comment
too.
with, when I was with the Japanese, we also went coast to coast, and we sampled conventional feedstocks, we tested organic, and we found way more heavy metals in organic than conventional. Because heavy metals are allowed to be used, you can use copper and zinc, or not zinc, but you can use heavy metals for fungicidal properties in
Look at that
organic.
chemtrail right there.
But did you find, how about glyphosate? Did you find that?
It's in everything.
Yeah.
There's nothing that glyphosate is not in.
Well, that was my question last week, was how can we test it to know it? Because the government says that 400 parts per billion won't hurt you, go ahead and eat the stuff. And so I finally found a way to get a test kit, and I got one, and I found out that there's that much in my water.
Yeah.
It's in everything.
And
It's absolutely in
everything.
We're getting the signal that we have to wrap up, sorry guys, so we will go ahead and pick our raffle. Jim, would you like to do the honors?
Oh,